The American Revolution. You know, it was a war fought not just over land, but over some really big ideas. So today, we're going to dive into the people behind the fight, the absolutely pivotal battles they waged, and how their struggle for independence didn't just create a new nation, it literally reshaped the world.
To really get this, you have to start with the man they were rebelling against, King George III. From his point of view over in London, the colonies weren't fighting for some noble cause like liberty, they were just in a state of chaos. And in a speech he gave in 1775, he made it crystal clear it was time to put a speedy end to these so-called disorders with brute force.
So what were these disorders the king was so upset about? Well, this wasn't something that just blew up overnight. No, the conflict had been simmering for more than a decade, and the story really kicks off with the fallout from a massive global war.
So picture this. Britain has just won the 7 Years' War. I mean, it was this huge, expensive war fought all over the globe. They were victorious, sure, but they were also buried in debt. So Parliament looks across the Atlantic to the American colonies and thinks, hey, they can help pay for this. And that led to a whole series of taxes, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, that the colonists saw as totally oppressive.
And this, right here, these four words became the rallying cry of the whole revolution. The colonists' argument was pretty simple. How can a parliament thousands of miles away, where we don't have a single elected voice, have the right to tax us? It was this fundamental argument about basic rights, and it just perfectly captured why everyone was getting so angry.
So as things start heating up, people in the colonies began to organize. Guys like Samuel Adams in Massachusetts were absolutely key here. They set up these things called the Committees of Correspondence, which was basically like an underground communication network. It connected patriot leaders up and down the 13 colonies and turned all that scattered anger into a real coordinated movement. The stage was set for some serious action.
And you know what the final straw was? Tea. A tax on tea. In December of 1773, a bunch of men in Boston decided they'd had enough. They dressed up as Native Americans, partly to hide who they were, snuck onto those British ships, and pulled off one of the most famous protests in all of history.
And look, this wasn't just a little symbolic gesture. This was a massive act of destruction. They chucked 342 chests of tea into the harbor. In today's money, that's worth nearly $2 million. It was a huge financial hit, and it sent a message to the king that you just couldn't ignore.
So how did Britain react? Well, they came down hard, really hard. They passed what the colonists started calling the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's port, they banned town meetings. But instead of crushing the rebellion, this heavy-handed approach just brought the colonies closer together and pushed them right to the edge of an all-out war.
And this just shows you how serious they were. Get this, even before they officially declared independence, the Second Continental Congress goes ahead and creates a unified army. And to lead it, they pick a Virginia delegate, a veteran of the last war named George Washington.
I mean, let's be real about the odds here. Washington was leading a ragtag army of farmers and merchants. They were poorly supplied, barely trained. And they were going up against the British Army, the most professional, best-equipped fighting force on the entire planet. On paper, it looked like an absolutely impossible fight.
Now, the American leaders, they weren't naive. They knew they couldn't possibly win this thing on their own. They needed a heavyweight in their corner to even the odds, and they knew exactly who to call. Britain's oldest and most bitter enemy, France.
France was definitely itching for some revenge after losing that last war, but King Louis XVI was not about to back a losing horse. He needed proof that the Americans could actually win, and that proof came in 1777 at Saratoga, where the Americans pulled off a stunning victory and forced an entire British army to surrender. That was the game changer. It convinced France to go all in, signing a formal treaty and committing troops, money, and their powerful navy to the cause.
And this is where the whole thing just goes global. Way down in the Caribbean, this tiny, neutral Dutch island called St. Eustatius became a lifeline for the rebellion. It was this bustling hub where American ships could sneak past British blockades to buy the gunpowder and weapons they so desperately needed.
Well, Britain wasn't going to let that stand. They eventually declared war on the Dutch, and Admiral George Rodney swooped in and seized the island. But he wasn't just there to shut down trade. He was there to get rich. He took everything, and he treated the island's prominent Jewish merchant community with exceptional cruelty, seizing their wealth and kicking them out. And you know, what happened there didn't go unnoticed. Rodney's brutal actions caused a huge uproar back in London. A really influential member of Parliament, Edmund Burke, actually stood up and condemned him for it, basically saying that targeting a vulnerable group like the Jews was a stain on Britain's honor. It just goes to show how the war's ripple effects were being felt all over the world.
And this is where it all comes together. A perfect storm of greed and timing. While Admiral Rodney was busy counting his loot on St. Eustatius, he completely failed to chase down the main French fleet. That fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, slipped away and was now sailing north, towards a date with destiny in Virginia.
De Grasse's fleet showed up in the Chesapeake Bay at the exact right moment. He sealed off the coast, completely trapping the main British army in the south, led by Lord Cornwallis, at a little port called Yorktown. Suddenly, for the British, there was no way out.
So you've got the French Navy blocking the sea, and then on land, you get this pincer movement. Washington's army and a big French force led by General Rochambeau march down and surround Yorktown. You had these three commanders, Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse, working together to create a perfect trap.
I mean, what could Cornwallis do? He was completely boxed in, outnumbered, with no hope of escape or reinforcement. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army. The Battle of Yorktown was the decisive knockout blow. This was it. This was the victory that effectively won the war.
Okay, so winning the war, that was the hard part, right? Well, maybe not. Now came the really hard part. Building a country from scratch. They now had to create a whole new kind of nation, one based not on a king, but on a set of really radical, new ideas.
See, this whole thing wasn't just about getting rid of a king. It was about putting these huge, world-changing ideas from the Enlightenment into practice. Concepts from thinkers like John Locke about natural rights, or Montesquieu on separating government powers. These weren't just theories anymore. They were the actual blueprint for a new government. The goal was to build a meritocracy, a wild idea at the time, where your ability, not your bloodline, decided your fate.
And then, a couple of years after Yorktown, the ink was finally dry. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially ending the war. Great Britain formally recognized the United States as a sovereign and independent nation. It was a historic moment. A new republic, founded on the consent of the governed, was now on the world stage.
Which really leaves you with this incredible question, right? A conflict that started as a pretty straightforward argument over taxes somehow morphed into this profound, successful experiment in self-government. It would go on to inspire people fighting for freedom all over the world. How did that happen? How did a fight over money end up completely redefining what a nation could be?